Welcome to Viewpoints. I'm Heather Isvaron, and with me today is Mark Stainbrook, Assistant Chief for San Diego Harbor Police. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
So among other things, you're a published author, Lieutenant Colonel in the Marine Corps Reserves, you have a master's degree, and a Fulbright scholar.
That's right.
It's pretty tall cotton.
And my family still just thinks I'm the dumbest person in the world.
Well, today we want to talk about diaspora and community-led policing. And so I have a couple of questions, but let's get some definitions started. So tell me what diaspora is.
So a diaspora is basically a large group of people that moves from one part of the world to another part of the world in a pretty short period of time, pretty compressed period of time. And it's usually fleeing war or maybe seeking jobs, trade, that sort of thing.
And then the community-led policing effort, when did that really fully engage, would you say? When did that trend start?
Well, community policing started pretty much in the 1980s, and some people called it a throwback to the days where the officer walked the beat, because we had gotten away from the communities, our communities, by being in a car so much and responding to radio calls that we had lost that connection. But after 9/11, we started looking at it in regards to how could we support counterterrorism efforts by using community policing.
And given that diaspora communities have grown so much in the current years, let's talk about those challenges that come with working in those communities.
Sure. Well, if you think about a traditional police officer walking their beat, they're probably really thinking about local issues. But when you introduce a diaspora community, depending on wherever they came from in the world, they're still very connected internationally with their home community. So you can imagine you have officers, they're really walking an international beat. And so say if their community is Iranian community, things that go on in Iran may be prescient to what that officer is dealing with in the community at that time. So it transcends local issues and truly is global, if you think of the global village.
Right. And I would imagine that there are a number of folks within that community that could be very suspicious of seeing a uniformed officer come around to their church, synagogue, wherever.
Sure. In a lot of countries, the police are not looked at favorably, and they're looked at as an arm of the state and a lot of times a dictatorship. And so diaspora communities bring that mentality over with them. And their kind of thought process is, I don't want to see a police officer. I don't want to engage a police officer. And where a lot of us grew up with police officers in our school and kind of the officer-friendly, Officer McGruff, and we look at police officers as our friend. You can go to a police officer if you have a problem. Kids growing up in a diaspora community may have not been acculturatized that way, and so they don't look at it quite that way.
And what are some of the more effective ways or some specific examples of how you've been able to do that? I mean, you worked in LAPD for a while and probably had to do that a bit. Right.
Well, going overseas quite a bit in the military, I went to Kosovo, served a tour in Kosovo and then Iraq, and then going over to the United Kingdom and working in Pakistani communities on my Fulbright fellowship, I was able to learn a lot about diaspora communities and those cultures. So I think one technique is you have to understand the community that you're working with. And you have to understand their history, their demographics, where they came from in the world, their local leadership, global leadership, their religion. And then you have to put things in context with what it means for them to have made that large-scale movement in a whole community setting and basically transplant the community that they came from to the United States in a very short period of time. And the fact that they still maintain interconnectivity with the community back in their home country, and they don't lose that. And so as a police officer, it's very eye-opening, and you have to look at that bigger picture when you're interacting with them. And part of the problems that we encountered was that we made mistakes as officers in how we approached the community, maybe not understanding their culture and not understanding the way they looked at law enforcement.
And so is there a specific example of where that actually worked, where maybe there was a miscommunication, but then
Sure.
you kind of built the bridge afterwards?
Well, in my master's thesis, what I found was that after 9/11, Muslim communities and American law enforcement didn't engage nearly enough. But when they did, the interaction was generally positive. So that what this told me is we need more positive interaction. In terms of learning about each other, one of the things that the Muslim community expressed was they didn't really understand the difference between local police, state police, and federal police, for example, or federal law enforcement. So when we would go to community meetings, a lot of their questions centered around immigration or airport security regulations. And we were going ill-equipped to answer those questions because I, as a local police officer, was more concerned about graffiti, parking, crime in their neighborhoods. And so one of the lessons we learned is you have to, if you can, come at them with a unified approach, all different levels of law enforcement. Go to these meetings with representatives from the FBI, the TSA, local law enforcement. And in that way, you can answer their broad array of questions about law enforcement and how we interact with their communities.
And so the solid relationships, I would imagine that we tend to put all Muslims in one pot when they come from very, very different areas around the globe. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. I was just reading a book called History of World Religions, which actually listed Christianity as being the most diverse religion in terms of beliefs, and probably closely followed by Islam. But that's an outstanding observation because what I always teach is there's some general practices, some general things you can do while trying to approach these communities, and it has to be done in a thoughtful manner. But the Afghani community in Fremont, which is Muslim, and the Iranian community in LA and the Somali community in Minnesota, all Muslim, but very different contexts about how they came to the United States, why they came, their socialization when they got here. And so although I can give general guidelines, really you have to learn about your own local community and see what works for you. So it's a big mistake to put everybody in the same basket, even just because they're Muslims.
Right. And so this whole community-led policing initiative and reaching out to the diaspora communities, is that what you would say is the most effective model of effective enforcement against violence, or is it just good community building?
It's a cliche to say winning hearts and minds. I personally think it's one of the most effective techniques. The problem is it's difficult because it has to be over a very long term, and then there has to be clever specialization of the officers engaged in this kind of activity. And you want to remain consistent throughout a long period of time, because what you're really changing is minds and changing ideas. But I don't see it any different as in being a young gang officer when I would get to know a gang member and over several years see them change as they graduated from high school or got married or had a job and got a job and had kids. I saw their mindset change, and I never considered them my friends, but they were on my beat and I got to know who they were and what they were up to. And I saw some of them turn their life around. So the same idea with an ideology, someone with an ideology different than yours, you want to have the ability to gain that relationship, gain that trust, and see ideas change and thought processes change. So winning of the hearts and minds is a long process, but it is very effective. We just have to be patient with it. And local police are best situated to engage in that kind of activity.
Because they're the ones that are going to be around to build those relationships anyway.
Right. We're there day in, day out for 20, 30 years.
20, 30 years. So in your most recent article published in Police Chief magazine entitled Policing with Muslim Communities in the Age of Terrorism, you give 3 strategies as a starting point for genuine community engagement. And I think that's really important that you put genuine in there, because it's something where, if it's a fake type of relationship, they're going to see that. It has to be real. So tell me about those 3 strategies.
Okay. Well, the first thing is Muslim communities would say to us, you only come see us when there's a terrorist attack. And that's very telling because it's probably true. And what we weren't doing, and I always say as a young officer, I went to Catholic churches and I went to Protestant churches. I went to synagogues. I had never been to a mosque. I couldn't tell you a police officer that I knew that went to a mosque. And so when we started engaging after 9/11, the thought process from Muslim communities was, you're just engaging us because of what happened in 9/11. You're just looking for terrorists. And that might have been true to an extent. But you have to learn how to build deeper, more long-lasting relationships. A lot of the problems in the Muslim community, say centered around the mosque, might be parking issues after Friday prayer. It might be graffiti. It might even be hate crimes because someone is anti-Islam in the neighborhood. And those are their concerns. So if you address those concerns first and build true relationships, people will begin to talk to you and tell you things. And so I always say, don't make the primary your primary job to gain information or intelligence. If you build relationships, then you'll gain information and intelligence. So we broke down our strategy into three ideas: direct approach, indirect approach, and media strategies. And the direct approach, the unfortunate thing about being a police officer is on a direct approach, when do we usually approach and engage is when there's a problem. So the time to do a direct approach isn't when Palestinians are outside the Israeli embassy or consulate in LA protesting, because it's in a conflictual environment. So what we want to do is use those opportunities in a non-conflictual environment, like community meetings and things like that, to get to know people. I mean, it seems simple, but the difficulty is, for example, understanding culture. Like, I wouldn't walk right into a mosque and start shaking women's hands and approaching women, because culturally that wouldn't really be acceptable. The second part was indirect approach. There were some occasions where the police were not the best vehicle to work in the community, and it could either cause a setback, or we have to view our role as connectors to other government services. So a great example to me was the fire department was setting up a project in which, during a disaster, they would use religious centers as areas to keep medical supplies, food, and that sort of thing. And they had reached out to churches and synagogues, but no one had reached out to mosques. And so very quietly behind the scenes, we guided the fire department to the right people in the mosques, particularly the Islamic Center of Southern California. And we introduced the right people, and the Muslim community engaged in this process very, very willingly. I mean, community service is a big part of Islam. And they actually took some lead roles. But it engaged them in a way which didn't have anything to do with terrorism, didn't have anything to do with law enforcement. It just engaged them in their community, and also meeting other religious leaders, which I thought was very important for inter-religious dialogue between different groups. So things like that. When it comes to media strategies, Muslim communities don't watch Fox News, and they don't watch maybe even CNN necessarily. They may be watching Al Jazeera. They may be looking at local papers or local TV, like Geo TV, which centered on Pakistan. Something in their own language, for example, like the LA Pakistani communities would read Urdu-based magazines. So we would make it an effort to get articles in there about LAPD in Urdu, so they could read it in their own language, especially some of the first generation whose English wasn't as good as the second or third generation. And in that way, we very carefully, developed a relationship with the local communities through their very specialized local media. So when I say media engagement strategies, it's really looking at it from a community standpoint. What are they reading? What are they watching? What are they listening to? And how can we engage in a clever way to engage them very subtly through those medium?
And then when an emergency happens, I've seen some really effective press conferences where you have multiple religions, the heads of those groups, meeting together and talking as one. I think that's probably the most effective and calming thing a community could see, is everybody coming together.
Absolutely. One of the interesting things after a terrorist attack, especially if the news is reporting it was terrorists who were Islamist, is that the Muslim community will be worried about retribution. And so it's a delicate situation, but you have to go in and engage with the mosques, and they may say, we want more police presence because we're concerned about graffiti. I recall a mosque was burned down in Florida after a terrorist attack. But you don't want the community to think you're there because you think they're suspects. It's actually just the opposite. So going into the mosque, especially after Friday prayer, for example, and getting up and speaking before the mosque and letting them know why there's extra police presence, actually they come up afterwards and thank you and understand why they're there. So also putting that out into their local media and reassurance programs is very helpful.
So what advice would you give for those departments? We have large-scale departments in our viewing community and small ones. What advice would you give them as they deal with not just faiths of different kind, but communities as a whole?
Right. Well, we made a lot of mistakes along the way, some which were very public at LAPD, but we were trying in a very genuine, open manner to engage. And so you have to have that care and concern for the community, and they'll see that. That'll come through, but sometimes it takes a while, so you have to be patient. What I tell people is it's a lot like being a doctor. You know, the Hippocratic Oath is first do no harm. And as a police officer, you don't want to just rush into the idea of community policing in these very complicated communities and complicated situations. You really do have to learn about all those things I mentioned earlier about the context of the diaspora community. History, religion, language, socioeconomic status, where do they work, where do they go to school? Because you're trying to paint a picture as to them, their community. And then cultural differences are hugely important. You can go in and insult people very easily by something you say or do, not meaning to, and it'll set you back forever. And so careful engagement, and a lot of times when you talk about indirect approaches or like third-party engagement, I would find out the groups or people that people in the community trusted or knew, and I would have them introduce me, so that if I introduced you to one of the Muslim community leaders, there's automatically that bond of trust because, well, if Mark says Heather is good, she's good. And that goes a long way in these communities, is that personal bond and relationship. And there's this idea of 3 cups of tea that, you know, after you have 3 cups of tea with somebody, it's business up until then, and then you're kind of friends, and you can talk about more serious issues. So getting introductions from other folks that are trusted by the community, really important. So when I teach my classes to different police departments about how to do this type of engagement, those are the kind of things I stress.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Heather.